Well, we continue our reflection on the mystery of the Lord's glorious ascension into heaven. Dom Guéranger, in his series on the liturgical year, writes that by his ascension into heaven, his priesthood of Calvary was transformed into a priesthood of glory. Now let us think back to Holy Thursday. On Holy Thursday, we commemorated the very first Mass, the institution of the priesthood, the institution of the Eucharist. Now, Holy Thursday was looking forward to Good Friday. So, what was instituted on Holy Thursday was the crucifixion, death, and resurrection of the Lord sacramentally, under a different appearance than what we see on the cross that happened on Good Friday. And yet we say that the Mass is the representation or representation of Good Friday. It's the very same sacrifice, the crucifixion, death, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ in an unbloody manner. All right, now with that in mind, we have these two things. We have the Mass and we have the bloody sacrifice of Christ. But then we're going to look at it from a different perspective now, because we also have the ascension of the Lord. And how does the ascension of the Lord work into this? Well, Guéranger says that his priesthood of Calvary was transformed into a priesthood of glory by his ascension into heaven. Now, in the book of the Apocalypse, we see that in heaven he is the Lamb upon his throne. He is the Lamb standing and, as it were, slain and yet standing, for he is radiant with glory and power. Guéranger continues here. These are Guéranger's words. "Oh, see him there in all his majesty as Son of God, standing in the attitude of infinite power. Yet withal he will not part with the semblance of the immolated. The sword of sacrifice has left 5 wounds upon him, and he would keep them for eternity. Yes, it is identically the same meek Lamb of Calvary, and he is to be forever consummating in glory the immolation he perfected on the cross." Now, immolation is the separation of his blood from his body. When immolation of a lamb is the separation of the blood from the body, bringing about the death of the lamb. So as the same meek Lamb of Calvary, he is ever to be consummating in glory the immolation he perfected on the cross. So we think about then the separation of the blood from the body of our Lord on the cross, and he is immolating that in heaven in a glorious way, which is very interesting to think about. How does he continue to consummate in glory the immolation he perfected on the cross? Well, the Mass is that immolation by the separation of the precious blood from the sacred body. That's called the immolation of the consecration of the chalice. Now the blood is not where the body is. It's someplace separate. And that goes back to the time of the priest Melchizedek, who immolated the wine from the bread in what has always been known as the sacrifice of the priest Melchizedek. So what is it that we behold here in this Mass, in these sacred ceremonies? We say that, and we believe that it is the unbloody representation, or representation as it's sometimes said, of the once for all bloody sacrifice on Calvary. It is represented. The presence of that is multiplied, but nothing new is added. But the Mass does not look like the crucifixion. It does not look like the death, and it does not look like the resurrection of the Lord. It looks like something else. Well, it looks like heaven. The Lord's priesthood is exercised from his throne in heaven. So all that has been anticipated of that heavenly liturgy was presented for the first time at the Last Supper in the cenacle of Jerusalem. Now let's look back to Holy Thursday, and we're going to take a look at a narrative that I gave to you on Holy Thursday about what that first Mass would have looked like. Now we look at it from a different perspective today because we're not looking forward to Good Friday. It's not Holy Thursday. But we're looking back upon it now, but we're looking at it now from a heavenly perspective. So as you listen to this narrative of the first Mass on Holy Thursday, think about it from a heavenly perspective, from our Lord exercising his priesthood from his heavenly throne as the Lamb who has been slain. And this is from the book called How Christ Said the First Mass by Father Meagher, and I think it's dated from around 1908. Father Meagher narrates it according to the Jewish customs at the time of Christ. He asserts that it would have been, the Last Supper, would have been a pontifical high Mass sung by the Lord, his apostles, and the people taking part in congregational singing. They are about to begin the synagogue prayers in the cenacle, as was the custom at that time. And the Lord gave special directions regarding the vestments they were to wear during the Egyptian Passover at the time of Moses. Quote, "And thus you shall eat it, you shall gird your reins, and you shall have shoes on your feet, holding staves in your hands." Unquote. And by lapse of time, these developed into the Passover vestments. The Lord was clothed in purple, for he was the prince of David's dynasty, and over this he clothes himself in vestments of a rabbi, while 7 apostles vested in sacred Passover robes. Just 7. We know there were 12, but only 7 vested in this way. And there they stand and put hands together, eyes on the floor, keeping custody of the eyes, has become suppliants in the presence of their God and Creator. Now these were the customary postures of prayer in the time of Christ, as is still seen at the beginning of Mass. First, they bowed deeply down before the holy scrolls in the ark, as the celebrant of the Mass bows down before the altar. So now we have the tabernacle on the altar, but in the synagogue they had scrolls that were richly covered that would look like the tabernacle. According to the temple custom, they recite the versicle in the psalm, the master beginning and the ministers responding. "I will go into the altar of God, to God who giveth joy to my youth. Judge me, O God, and distinguish my cause from the nation that is not holy." You recognize that, Psalm 42, at the beginning of Mass is recited. Christ beginning and the apostles responding, and thus they recited the whole psalm. And the liturgy St. Peter composed at Antioch, still followed by the Maronites. They follow this custom of temple and cenacle, beginning this psalm when entering the sanctuary. They say it as they're entering the sanctuary. Here we say it at the foot of the altar before we enter into the Holy of Holies. Now after the prayers at the foot of the staircase, Christ with his 2 ministers went up to the ark and kissed the place where the holy scrolls rested. That was a synagogue ceremony, a sign of their love of the law, and this the celebrant of the Mass now does. The Lord takes the censer, he puts incense on the burning coals with blessing, and with an apostle on each side of him bows deeply before the holy scrolls of Moses and the prophets, the Torah and the Heptarah. First he incenses the Torah in the middle, then on each side where rest the other sacred books of the Old Testament, and handing the censer to one of the apostles at the right side of the ark, the latter incenses him as the rabbi on the right side, just as happens in a high Mass. Then they go to the middle, bow deeply down before the holy scrolls, and return to the floor of the bema. Now, did Christ hold out his hands with his body forming a cross as he stretched out his hands when he was crucified, as the celebrant of the Mass holds his hands? Now, in certain rites of the Mass, and you see this in the Carmelite rite and in the Dominican rite, they hold their hands way out. I think in the Dominican rite, they maybe hold them like this. In the Carmelite rite, they hold them out in the form of a cross. And in the Roman rite, they're held very close so that you can't see them, because the priest himself is the icon, the screen, and so he holds his hands very close, but he's still holding his hands out as though crucified. They go up the steps of the ark and deeply bow down before the law. They open the ark and reverently take out the scrolls of the law. While they read the scriptures in the temple or synagogue, the clergy stood while the congregation sat. Now, when the Lord and his 7 ministers had finished the synagogue services, they sat within the bema or sanctuary as the bishop sits on his throne surrounded by his ministers during the first part of the Mass. And then the Lord and his ministers rose from their seats, bowed deeply down before the Torah, the law, and then they marched from the sanctuary to the table in the middle of the cenacle. And following the temple rite, they marched before him according to their dignity, as the clergy still go before the bishop up to the altar. And so you think about that, the order of a procession in the church. We always have the incense, the thurifer, out in front, followed by the candles and the cross, and then followed hierarchically by others who are serving. And then if there are deacons, then the deacons go, and then the priests by rank, by order in terms of the date of their ordination or their dignity. So the priests first, any assistant priests, followed by the pastors, followed by monsignors, followed by any additional bishops who might be present, followed by the archbishop or the reigning bishop of that diocese or archdiocese. And then if there are cardinals or the pope, well, that's altogether different. But there's always a hierarchy. And so what does this mean? Well, this figures the patriarchs who came first, then the prophets, then the priests and holy men of the ancient world who went before Christ to prepare for his coming in person. In his person, in his prophecy, and his ceremonials. And this is the reason that in all church ceremonials the celebrant comes last, because Christ came last after all those others had prepared the way. Now, clothed in sacred vestments, each carrying his staff, they marched to the table as the Lord had commanded them to eat the Passover lamb. First, you have 5 apostles who had acted as his ministers. They went. And then you have the 7 that I mentioned earlier, who had read the 7 sections of the law. And lastly came the prince of the house of David, clothed in royal purple and vestments that were made of cloth of gold and were embroidered in white, red, green, and violet, the sacred colors of the temple of the Lord of hosts. So he wasn't wearing simple garments. He wasn't wearing humble garments. They were quite elaborate, beautiful, costly garments, which was appropriate for the occasion. But as the law laid down that not less than 10 nor more than 20 persons could form a band to celebrate the Passover, all withdrew and left him alone with his apostles, forming a band of 13. And with the great chalice was a silver plate belonging to the set Melchizedek had used when he offered bread and wine. This paten held the 3 cakes of unfermented bread, and chalice and paten were covered with napkins, as the sacred vessels are covered on our altars. Now, what we're seeing here is something that has been passed down in the Mass, but it doesn't look at all like the crucifixion of Christ on the cross, or his death, or his resurrection, but is influenced by the fact that he presented this, and then he went to his cross, he died, he rose again, and he ascended into heaven. And from heaven he exercises his priesthood in a glorious manner. And it is that glorious manner that we gaze upon what we see here in the Mass. But just as if you've ever looked at an icon, and an icon is not a piece of art, an icon is a window through which you see this particular template of each icon, and through that you look through as a window to a different reality. And so it is that the Mass is like an icon, and you gaze through it to a different reality. You gaze through this beautiful ceremony of something heavenly, and what do you see? Well, you see that. Doesn't look like that, but that's what you're seeing. And perhaps our Lord just knows what we need. The day after day, and Sunday after Sunday, and year after year, we couldn't bear to look upon that. And so, acknowledging our humility and our weakness, he lets us see this. He lets us gaze upon a heavenly image. This is the icon we look at. And we see that through the eyes of faith in a beautiful way that encourages us, lifts us up, helps us to hope for something greater in heaven. And it is from his heavenly throne that he is exercising that priesthood. So that gives us a different perspective now. And we've had to go through all of this in order to get here. And now that we're here in Ascension Tide, we can appreciate Holy Thursday in a whole different way. Now we'll be pondering over this, and we'll look at it again on Corpus Christi as we commemorate Holy Thursday on Corpus Christi Thursday. And we'll look at it from another perspective. Again, the Mass has so many layers. It's all of this. It is the Passion of the Lord. It is a heavenly liturgy. There are angels and incense and bells and all sorts of investments. And it goes back to the time of Melchizedek, goes back to the time of Moses and King David and the Cenacle and Holy Thursday, Pontifical High Mass on Holy Thursday, and here we are today. The very same mysteries being represented in this marvelous, mysterious, and beautiful way. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.